the other story is an interesting one, and this kind of hurts my soul as a PlayStation gamer. Kotaku, for the last couple of days in the previous week, I should say, it was Wednesday and Thursday, have collectively come out with some not great articles about Sony's storefront. You know, the first one came on Wednesday. Both are written by John Walker, where they commented on the fact that, you know, if you want to get your game noticed on PlayStation, like very visibly, like, you know, up there on the storefronts, maybe easier to find, because look, I'm a Sony gamer. I can flat out admit the PlayStation Store sucks. I'm so annoyed that PS5, for everything that I love about that console, the storefront is an absolute dumpster fire. I hate it. Trying to find games, I can't even find demos for the game. I recently wanted to get the demo for Chaos, the Final Fantasy game, or, you know, the Final Fantasy Origin game, and it took me having to literally search it manually to find it. There's no demo section. It's not in the free game section where it usually is on the PlayStation 4 storefront. And, you know, that was a pain in the ass. And now if you want to find anything, like, all at once in the blue moon, go into the newest section and just scroll down and see what's there. That's the best option that I have. And sometimes that still falls through the cracks. You know, a lot of the times when it comes to indie games, you know, I have to know through articles, I have to know through YouTube videos, I have to know through reviews and all that, like, to find out what the big game in town is for the current month, what's going on. And not to mention, you know, there's other ways to find it too. Like Steam has been a big part of that for the indie scene. Xbox Game Pass helps a lot with that. Sometimes there's the diamond in the rough you get on PlayStation Plus, but that isn't always the case. So the initial article was saying, hey, there's a $25,000 fee if you want to get some better visibility when it comes to your storefront. And if you're an indie game publisher, that's a lot of money. That's probably nothing you can do. And I saw that article and went, that is insane. I don't understand. Like, unless it's literally front page, I guess I can understand it. But even then, I'm still like, dude, that's really ridiculous. For $25,000? And, man, that's just weird. Because, like, if your game's really good, shouldn't just the traction, like the traffic of that game, would that not determine whether or not it gets put up on the front? Like, I would, if I was Sony, I'm thinking, well, if game sales are high for this game, I want to put it on the front because it's going to make us more money. Whereas it seems if you even want to get a chance at being seen so you can even start that train, you got to put some money up front. And that seems a little bit backwards. But the follow-up, the following day, because a lot of people reacted. So this is verbatim from Kotaku's Thursday article, which is PlayStation is hard to work with, devs say, again, written by John Walker. The one line that stands out right at the very beginning is there were two main responses to our article yesterday, highlighting one independent developer's frustrations with working with Sony to sell games on the PlayStation Store. This was referring to the $25,000 fee that was required to pay. The first was a confusing number of people convinced that this was somehow part of an underground conspiracy to destroy Sony. Lol, console war. I could go on forever about why I hate the fact that people think that, you know, because you say something mean about a company that makes the console that they're currently playing on, you have to outright defend them. I'll say this again and again. I am a Sony owner. I play and own a PlayStation 5, and yeah, I do have a vested interest in what they're doing. But if something is bad on their end, I'm not going to hide that. I will end up giving some bias to Sony because, again, that's where my knowledge is. Like, I would love to be a Nintendo fanboy. Maybe. But I don't own the console. I haven't played any of their games in quite some time. I don't have the immediate Jesus, English is a difficult language sometimes, folks. Attraction and attachment to, you know, the console itself, to the company. So I do have a bit of favoritism to Sony because I play them, but I'm not going to hide when they do something that I don't think is right. And obviously, it seems that if you're an independent developer for Sony, it just doesn't work. And people seem to jump at that. I try not to. So to finish off that paragraph, the second was many indie game developers and publishers getting in touch to say that, yes, wow, Sony are far harder to work with and sell games through anywhere else. It's not possible to rationalize with the former group. We had confirmed hard figures on Sony's fees for getting an invisibility on the PlayStation's inbuilt store, so we reported them. The conspiracy disappointingly ends there. However, the information about just how much worse it is for indies to work with Sony than Microsoft or Nintendo keeps piling in. So a lot of these were anonymous. A lot of this was people that reached out to Kotaku, so I'm not going to take these with the utmost of validity, but I'm also not going to take them with a grain of salt. But just keep in mind that most of these we don't have a name attached to, so we can't verify for sure if this is an actual developer or if this is just some person who just, has it out for Sony and wants to take a shot at it. I can't, tell you either way. One such response had, oh yeah, so there's Nintendo who supports you, then Microsoft who supports you, and then there's Sony who supports its own AAA machine and gives a fuck about everyone else. We know that Sony, their concentration is on their big AAA games because that is their moneymaker. I'm not going to pretend that their indie scene is thriving. I think that they do an okay job at promoting a few independent titles, although some of them tend to be under Sony's banner anyway. But I think that they don't outright ignore indie. I don't think they do the best job, but I think we have to also keep in mind, and I'm trying not to be a defense lawyer for Sony right now, but Sony's bread and butter right now is not on independent gaming, on indie gaming. It should be. I'd love it to be because a lot of great stuff comes out of the indie scene. But generally speaking, I think the way that Sony's strategy with indie games is that if you are deep enough into the indie scene, you don't need them to tell you. Because most of you are familiar with what goes on with Steam. Most of you are familiar with, say, what YouTubers are saying about it, what other sites are saying about these indie games. And generally speaking, most really popular indie games, if they're going to get any traction on consoles, it's going to be through already previously, well-known PR that's been done to it. Everybody knows about this game already, so of course they'll get it on a console as well. Your Enter the Gungeons, your Fall Guys, those games exist because they already did pretty well. Actually, Fall Guys is a weird example because they also were free the first month they were out. But Enter the Gungeon, for example, would be one. So it isn't always the case. I don't want to pretend that Sony is probably not being the greatest with indie developers. And this is probably more to do with smaller indie devs. I don't think if you're Supergiant or other companies, I don't think you're having nearly as difficult a time because you have the track record. But if you're an indie developer trying to get started, trying to get their game out there, it maybe is a little bit more difficult. Now, at the same time, keep in mind that it isn't always easy too. There's a lot of really horrendously bad games on Sony's digital front in the same vein that Steam is the same way. I'm sure Nintendo and Xbox are the exact same way. I have played at one point some very weird, I used to go through the demo section just to try everything. There is some really, really low quality stuff that kind of gets just buried in the PlayStation Store. And it's like that everywhere else. So I'm not going to assume that every case is like this indie gem that isn't getting to have its, chance to shine. Whereas it might just be games that really weren't going to make a dent anyway, and they're just a little bit salty because they had to pay a fee, which I don't agree with. But at the same time, I want to keep that part in mind that not every game that we're talking about potentially, because these, again, are all anonymous comments. We don't know if this is a spokesperson for Supergiant, like I said, or some really big indie company. It could be a guy who has sold 20 copies of their game that they made on their own, which, believe me, I envy you guys that can do that stuff because I do not have the drive to put that much work for that long. And I know it sucks that you don't get to see the fruits of your labor because no one either knows it's on the store or it just doesn't seem to work out. So I'm in both camps in this, but we'll keep reading quotes. So this is another independent, anonymous one. Sony doesn't understand what indie means. Not at all. For them, indie is something in the lower million budgets. Another one says, no platform is great, but Sony is particularly terrible. They know it too. They've had a problem for a long time, and they've been telling devs they have a problem for a long time, but they've just never fixed anything, so the problem persists. Another one, we get people every week saying, saw your game on the Xbox dashboard today. The Xbox UI feels like a mess, but in reality, it's actually kind of interesting that they just have so many different places to feature games. Sony obviously seems to not be that. On Switch, there's a indie thing, or an indie developer, again, another anonymous comment saying, without paying for featuring, there are spots on the eShop you will appear without paying. New releases, great deals, all those kinds of lists, and they will put new releases and decent discounts into the Discover tab too. There was also a few people that show like pie charts of how their sales went across consoles. Whitethorn Games was publishing one that showed Switch made up 60%, Xbox 30, Steam 7, PlayStation 3. Those Awesome Guys, another indie developer, showed 91.5% on Steam, 7.6% on Switch, 0.6% on Xbox, 0.3% on PlayStation. Another one said the exact sales figures for one release they had sold around 20,000 on Xbox compared to 7,000 on PlayStation. However, on DLC, the Microsoft console shifted 2,000 units of its DLC and Sony only 7. Now, numerically, I know a lot of people will see these numbers and automatically go, oh, wow, Sony just doesn't seem to do much for it. I don't know if we can automatically say that it's, them not choosing to put stuff on there. I don't have any proof on it. These are just numbers. And believe me, if there was all this stuff that said, oh yeah, Sony just goes out of their way to just not show indie games, sure. I can kind of believe that anyway, because again, finding games can sometimes be hard, but it's a really difficult thing for me to comment on personally, because again, I suppose it doesn't help for me personally because I don't deep dive for indie games very often. I'm generally speaking a long form like JRPG or open world game. I'm trying to like get just a couple of games that take a bunch of time out because I don't have nearly as much time as I used to. And I'm trying not to spend a lot of money either because I ain't making millions. So it's a difficult thing for me to personally see. Like, I don't know, without knowing which games these are. Like, if I found it that's, so let's say, I'm trying to pull a game out of my ass here. Let's say is it the Swords of Ditto? I think it's the Swords of Ditto. Let's say if they came out and said, oh, by the way, on Steam, we sold this game for, let's say, about 50,000 copies. Switch, we did about 20,000. Xbox, we did about 15,000. PlayStation, we did about 2,000. Yeah, that's a little weird. That would be a little bit strange. But I mean, again, the examples that we're getting are just one or two. And they can say that, oh, there's a bunch of them and whatever else, but I don't know if this is necessarily a PlayStation problem or if maybe just the game doesn't seem to do very well on that console. Because again, keep in mind, what's the bread and butter of this console right now? It's its big AAA library. And it's very easy for people to get lost in that. It's easy for people, by the way, and I'm not trying to take a shot at Nintendo, but look, I'm just going to say it. It's really easy for people on Nintendo to find indie games because there's nothing releasing on that console of high AAA quality. If Nintendo has a game a month, 2 games a month of major high quality coming out on their console, then maybe indie games die down a little bit because people are too busy buying the bigger games on that console. But it doesn't. It isn't like that. I mean, we're sitting here with Mario Golf already being, kind of shot into the air by a lot of people just not happy with it. And it's very easy for indie games to go because, not to mention, it's like a portable device. So indie games kind of work really well on those consoles. I mean, one of my best friends, he loves playing games on Switch and does it a lot. So he usually will buy a game on Steam and sometimes also buy a copy on Switch and just kind of mess around with it there. And it works out really well for him that way. I think Switch is actually a pretty decent console for indie games because of its portability. But again, I'm also going to go back to, I'm going to be honest, I'm pretty sure a large portion of indie sales happen because there's nothing else on the store. So it's easier for games to get pushed to the top because there's not much else they're competing with once you get past the 6 months of everybody buying the one big game. Your Zeldas, your Marios, your Donkey Kongs, your Metroid. Well, I guess most of these aren't happening right now. But all the big games, like, Breath of the Wild might be a big deal on the store, but once everybody starts buying it, something else has to climb in that place. Whereas with Sony, there is a lot on that console that gets released. I know that it doesn't feel that way because we've been in a couple of years of pandemic gaming releases, but keep in mind that in the heyday of PlayStation 4, when things were at its busiest, it was so easy to get lost in that storefront, even with the PlayStation 4 storefront being a lot better. So I'm going to say this to end this entire article, that I do believe that Sony is probably not doing the best job at taking care of indie developers a little bit better. I mean, the $25,000 fee is ridiculous to me. I hate that. I think that's insane. But when it comes to stories like what I'm hearing, like, oh, they're hard to work with, I'm assuming that every publisher, every console is going to be somewhat hard to work with because they want their cut, they want their money, so they're going to be pretty specific on what they want. Now, I know in some cases, I think Steam at one point used to be the easiest thing to do, and it's probably still is because, Steam, it's impossible to figure out what you want to do with Steam games. There's so much. But I think with with Xbox and PlayStation specifically, because these are the two big game consoles, they have a lot of AAA releases. I think it's easier for games to be lost in there. I mean, we saw with some of those stats, like Switch does really well, Steam does really well, Xbox and PlayStation, sometimes not so much. Now, the few examples that we got seems to paint PlayStation a really bad light. But without knowing what games they are, I can't tell you if it's a game that maybe actually didn't deserve the sales on PlayStation. Like, I don't know. So to take everything as it is, I mean, simply put, I don't like the idea of Sony possibly making it very difficult for indies to get their games on their storefront and to get any traction on their storefront. But I'm also not going to sit here and tell you that this is something that grossly affects me and I hate and it needs to be ended immediately because I want my indie games. Because flat out, I don't play nearly as many indie games as I probably should. But based on the kind of games that I play, I don't generally have as much time to take a risk on a game that I don't really know much about. So for me personally, it's not the easiest thing for me to comment on because I don't have the bias to lean in the favor of the independent publishers because I don't have all these horses in that race. I'm more just on the back end being like, okay, well, if Sony's treating them badly, okay, Sony, treat them better. That's the best I can give. Sony, if you're actually treating independent developers horribly, this is an easy fix. You have the money to. Don't kid ourselves on this. We know you have the money to do it. Look at all the money you're making off of all your games. You can do a little bit of a better job. And most importantly, fix the frickin' PS5 storefront. It's horrible. Solve that problem first, and I think some of the visibility errors can be corrected already with that. And then on top of that, get rid of your stupid-ass fee. Unless you're trying to, if you have never heard of this developer before, and you're just doing be like, hey, we don't just want to throw this thing on, the main page because we don't have a clue on what your game is going to be. Well, I mean, the problem would be obviously solved if somebody tested all these games beforehand to see if they were worth putting on the storefront, but we know a lot of these things don't. So there's that. There are a lot of fixes that could be done. The simplest thing is get rid of the fee and, just be a little bit more open. And I think we're getting to the point now that as we get further into this cycle of this console generation, that we start to see if Sony is going to become the asshole that Xbox decided to be in the previous generation when they wanted to just block everything off because they thought they had it won. And that's the worry that I'm getting here. Stories like this make me wonder if Sony is becoming the villain again because they won so easily in the last generation. And I hope that stories like this don't keep coming because it's going to make me as a PlayStation owner feel like, oh crap, the drought's coming and I made a poor, decision in buying this console over a different one. Now I have Game Pass on PC, so, at the very least, I'm not missing out on too much, so I'm not freaking out as much as I would have if I had bought the Xbox One instead of the PS4. So, me personally, I'm not worried about it nearly as much, but I'm not liking the direction we're going in so far. But yeah, let us know in the comments below what you think about that. Obviously, Sony with what's going on, it's a tough issue. I'm trying so hard not to let my bias take over here, but there is an honest part of me that's like, I don't particularly care too much about this because it doesn't really affect me. But it still goes down to that, okay, if we're charging a $25,000 fee, that's pretty ridiculous. Can we at least stop that? That's really dumb. But otherwise, I don't know. Without knowing what games we're talking about in the indie scene, I can't tell you whether these are complaints that are deserved, because if the game might be really bad, I don't really want it visible either, because I've played a couple of demos, like I said, on the PlayStation Store for indie games that I'm like, man, this doesn't even deserve to be on the storefront. I really hope this doesn't get pushed at all because I don't want people to be buying these. But that's a whole other story. So yeah, let me know what you think in that.